On October 14, 1962, a United States U-2 photoplane captured a series of suspicious pictures of Soviet missiles stationed in Cuba. The characteristics of the missiles and the missile sites were strangely familiar. They were later identified as Soviet Union's SS-4 medium-range ballistic missiles, nuclear warheads capable of hitting anything in a 2,000-mile radius.
In their mind, we had advanced far too close to their territory by stationing nuclear sites in Europe and in Turkey.
On October 16th, President Kennedy told of the news
to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack.
And the panic began. Fidel Castro came to power in 1959 after a successful revolution of the Cuban government. When Castro embraced communism, the Cuban foreign relations with the United States had been lost.
He had come to power against a very oppressive and not respected Batista, a dictator for many years with great human rights violations. And so when he came to power, initially he came to Washington, and people did not know what to expect from him.
The CIA trained a force of Cuban exiles to secretly invade Cuba. The mission was to take down Fidel Castro and stop the spread of communism. 1,400 Cuban exile groups landed quietly on the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961.
President Kennedy comes into office. This plan has already been developed. It is presented to him, and he accepts it and goes ahead.
The Soviet Union had known about the invasion and deployed all of its military forces to defend from it. The invasion was a disaster, as the forces were met by a fully prepared army of 20,000 Castro soldiers. 3 days later, it was announced that the invasion was over. 114 ex-Cuban invasion forces had died in a failed attempt to raid Cuba.
But eventually, the result is that Castro does get a promise from Kennedy that he won't try to invade again. He doesn't say he won't try to kill him, but he does say he's not going to invade again. And he keeps his word, and every president since then has also kept that word.
The invasion had confirmed all previous suspicions of an armed intervention, and Fidel Castro pursued closer relations with the Soviet Union for protection.
And so if you're Fidel Castro, your fear is that you need to protect your island against another invasion. What better way to do that than to invite Soviet missiles onto your island?
Because the US and NATO allies were surrounding the Soviet Union with strategic missiles, Castro's fear was the perfect opportunity to enable the Soviet Union to store nuclear missiles close to the United States.
They saw this as kind of a way to get back at the United States in terms of this balance of power. So,
numerous photographs taken by spy planes seem to say the same thing. The cargo was in fact military arms being sent to Cuba from the Soviet Union. The proof was sufficient, and the game was up.
Ambassador Zorin denied that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sites in Cuba. Yes or no?
You will have your answer in due course.
I'm prepared to wait for my answer until hell freezes over, if that's your decision.
Alarmed by the sudden events, Kennedy formed the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, a select group of 12 individuals, handpicked by President Kennedy himself, in order to advise him in a crisis like this. Initially, Kennedy blamed himself for the situation, regretting his earlier decision to approve the Bay of Pigs invasion after he had said the US would not interfere. ExComm meetings resulted in nods toward bombing in Cuba, but Kennedy did not believe a full-scale invasion was necessary.
What happened was that two leaders decided that nuclear war had to be avoided.
He saw more than the potential dangers of the missiles. It was unwise to focus exclusively on Cuba, for international relations also held ground in other territories, and the Soviet Union could operate against the US on more than one plane. Even the smallest miscalculation could result in foreign relation disasters or even nuclear war. The finalized plan was a quarantine. With the American military in place, this would prohibit Soviet ships from entering Cuba.
Khrushchev had met with President Kennedy, a very young, new president, in Vienna. And in that conversation, he had evaluated Kennedy and probably walked away thinking that this was a young, inexperienced person, not strong.
Despite the quarantine, 2 Soviet ships steamed towards the blockade line, closely guarded by 2 submarines, identified to have nuclear torpedoes. From the Kremlin, Khrushchev hoped the Americans would back down and played his last card. At this point, the tension of the crisis was at its peak. A single shot from a US destroyer could ignite a chain reaction of events leading to a devastating nuclear war.
A nuclear war came very, very close to being launched. And that could have meant setting back this whole earth that we live on and care for so much considerably.
The United States had no choice but to assume the threat and enter a military state called DEFCON 2. The military units on ground were given nuclear weapons, a target, and a 15-minute alert, while the U.S. Strategic Air Command was airborne and ready to attack at any moment. A step in the wrong direction could have led to catastrophic results. Mankind was truly at the brink of nuclear war. Then all of a sudden, the crisis came to a tense standstill as Soviet ships halted before they reached the blockade. Although the Soviet ships had stopped, the danger of the nuclear weapons were still imminent. Meanwhile, in the White House, Khrushchev sent a personal message to Kennedy. He wanted to end the escalating crisis. Khrushchev was willing to pull out the missiles in exchange for a US pledge not to invade Cuba. The Soviets reiterated this message through other sources and outlined the terms of negotiations. It seemed as if all was well. However, peace did not last. The next morning, ExComm received yet another letter from Khrushchev outlining the new conditions, the removal of NATO missiles from Turkey. This would appear as if the United States was trading the safety of its allies in exchange for its own. Without much time left, pressures were upon Kennedy to make the crucial decision. ExComm had a better idea. The president was to ignore Khrushchev's second letter and accept the terms of the first. To the public, this would seem as if Kennedy had accepted Soviet terms. He knew this plan wouldn't satisfy the Russians, so he sent his brother Bobby to negotiate the terms with the Soviet Union, in which the United States would pull out nuclear weapons from Turkey after the crisis had invaded, as long as this was kept a secret from the public. If Khrushchev accepted the compromise, both nations would be victorious. However, if he rejected it, war would follow. On October 28th, Khrushchev gave orders to pull out missiles from Cuba. The crisis was finally over.
We understand better now the degree to which we should give credit to Mr. Khrushchev as well as to Mr. Kennedy for understanding the need to pull back from the brink.
Shortly after, both countries signed a nuclear partial test ban treaty that paved the way for future nuclear arms reduction.
It lessened the chances of a nuclear exchange. And I think it slowly led us towards the end of the Cold War, 30 years later.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a prime example of the peaceful negotiation that effective diplomacy could generate. It taught the superpowers the responsibilities they bore to not only the people, but to the planet they live in. In the midst of the Cold War, Kennedy's strategic international tactics enabled the US to avoid a nuclear war, a decision that could have been disastrous in the blinding week that changed the world.
Our goal is not the victory of might, but the vindication of right. Not peace at the expense of freedom, but both peace and freedom here in this hemisphere, and we hope around the world. God willing, that goal will be achieved. Thank you and good night.